The day the sky turned purple was the day everything changed. It was a Tuesday, and people were going about their normal lives. Kids were in school, adults were at work, and the world kept spinning as it always had. Then, without warning, the clouds parted. A massive ship, bigger than any city on Earth, appeared above New York. Its surface shimmered like oil on water, changing colors in the sunlight. People stopped in their tracks, mouths open, eyes wide. Traffic came to a standstill as drivers got out of their cars to stare at the sky. News channels across the globe interrupted their regular programs. Reporters, as shocked as everyone else, struggled to describe what they were seeing. Social media exploded with photos and videos of the alien ship. Within minutes, the whole world knew we were not alone. As the initial shock wore off, panic set in. People rushed to stores, buying up food and supplies. Others ran to their homes, hoping to find safety with their families. The streets became a chaotic mix of abandoned cars and frantic people. World leaders gathered in emergency meetings. Military forces around the globe went on high alert. But against a ship of that size, what could they really do? Hours passed, and the ship remained silent and motionless. Then, as the sun began to set, something changed. A beam of soft, blue light shot down from the ship, landing in Central Park. The light spread, forming a perfect circle about 50 feet wide. From this circle of light, they emerge. Tall, slender beings with skin that seemed to shift and change like their ship. Their eyes were large and completely black, reflecting the world around them like mirrors. They moved with a grace that seemed almost unreal, as if gravity didn't affect them the same way it did humans. These beings, who would later call themselves the manipulators, approached the gathered crowd of humans. People backed away, a mix of fear and awe on their faces. But then something strange happened. One of the aliens raised a hand, and suddenly, the fear disappeared. People's faces went blank, then relaxed into peaceful smiles. They stepped forward, welcoming the aliens with open arms. But not everyone was affected. In the crowd, a young woman named Sarah blinked in confusion. She watched as those around her began to act like robots, their movements stiff and unnatural. Sarah's heart raced. Why wasn't she being controlled like the others? She looked around frantically, trying to find someone else who seemed aware. Her eyes met those of an old man across the crowd. He gave her a subtle nod, confirming her suspicions. They weren't alone. Over the next few days, more ships appeared over major cities worldwide. The same scene played out everywhere. The blue light, the aliens emerging, and then the strange, peaceful acceptance from most humans. World leaders appeared on TV, assuring everyone that the aliens came in peace. They spoke about a new era of intergalactic cooperation. But to Sarah and the few others who remained unaffected, something felt terribly wrong. The manipulators began to integrate into human society. They took positions in governments, corporations, and schools. They said they were here to help, to guide humanity to a better future, and most people believed them without question. But Sarah and the others who were immune saw the truth. They watched as their friends and family became shells of themselves, going through the motions of life, but lacking the spark that made them unique. In secret meetings held in basements and abandoned buildings, the immune gathered. They shared their experiences and tried to understand why they were different. Some thought it was a genetic quirk. Others believed it was the strength of their will. Whatever the reason, they knew they had to do something. As the days turned into weeks, the changes in society became more apparent. Crime rates dropped to zero. Productivity soared. On the surface, it seemed like a utopia. But for those who could see clearly, it was a nightmare. The manipulators' control wasn't perfect, though. Sometimes, people would briefly break free. They would look around in confusion, as if waking from a dream, before the alien influence took hold again. These moments gave Sarah and the other immune hope. If people could break free for a moment, maybe they could be freed permanently. But how? The immune were vastly outnumbered, and they had no way to fight against the manipulators' abilities. They needed a plan, a way to wake up the rest of humanity. As Sarah lay in bed one night, unable to sleep, she made a decision. She would find a way to stop the manipulators, no matter what it took. Little did she know, this decision would set in motion a chain of events that would change the fate of humanity forever. The battle for the human mind had begun, and the stakes couldn't be higher. It was time for humanity to prove just how uncontrollable their minds could be. Sarah walked quickly through the dark streets, her heart pounding. It had been 3 months since the manipulators arrived, and the world had changed completely. The streets were clean, people were polite, and everything seemed perfect. But Sarah knew better. She ducked into an alley, checking to make sure no one was following her. At the end of the alley was an old door with peeling paint. She knocked 3 times, paused, then knocked twice more. The door opened a crack. "Password?" a gruff voice asked. "The mind is our fortress," Sarah whispered. The door opened, and Sarah slipped inside. She found herself in a dimly lit basement. About 20 people were there, all ages and backgrounds. They were the immune, the ones the manipulators couldn't control. An old man named George stood up. He had been a psychology professor before the invasion. "Welcome, everyone," he said. "We have some new faces tonight. Let's begin." Sarah listened as George explained what they knew so far. The manipulators used some kind of telepathic ability to control humans, but for some reason, it didn't work on everyone. "We need to understand why we're immune," George said. "It's our best chance of fighting back." A young scientist named Alex raised his hand. "I've been running some tests," he said. "It seems our brains produce a unique electrical pattern when we're exposed to the manipulator's influence. It's like our minds create a shield." This news excited everyone. It was the first real clue they had about their immunity. "But how do we use this information?" someone asked. "I have an idea," Sarah said, standing up. All eyes turned to her. "We know that some people can break free of the control for short periods. What if we could extend those moments? Create a device that mimics our brain patterns." The room buzzed with excitement. It was a long shot, but it was hope. Over the next few weeks, the resistance worked tirelessly. Alex and his team tried to create a device that could disrupt the manipulator's control. Others worked on gathering information and recruiting new members. Sarah's job was one of the most dangerous. She had to pretend to be under control, living among the manipulated humans and even interacting with the aliens. It was terrifying, but it provided valuable information. One day, while pretending to work at her old job, Sarah overheard 2 manipulators talking. "The humans are challenging," one said. "Their minds resist in ways we've never seen." "Yes," the other replied. "Even those under control, their thoughts are chaotic, unpredictable." Sarah's heart raced. This was important information. She couldn't wait to tell the others. That night, at another resistance meeting, Sarah shared what she had heard. "Don't you see?" she said excitedly. "They're struggling to control us. Our minds are naturally resistant." George nodded thoughtfully. "It makes sense. Human consciousness is incredibly complex. We don't even fully understand it ourselves. So how do we use this?" someone asked. "We need to wake people up," Alex said. "If their natural resistance is there, we just need to trigger it." The group began to form a plan. They would use Alex's device to break the manipulator's control on a small group of people. If it worked, they could slowly expand their efforts. As the meeting ended, Sarah felt a mix of hope and fear. What they were planning was incredibly dangerous. If they were caught, the consequences would be severe. But as she looked around at the determined faces of her fellow resistance members, she knew they had to try. Humanity's freedom was at stake. The next day, they put their plan into action. Sarah and a small team went to a quiet park. Alex had disguised his device as an ordinary radio. With shaking hands, Sarah turned it on. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, a woman nearby blinked rapidly. She looked around in confusion. "Where? What's happening?" the woman asked. Sarah's heart leaped. It was working. But their celebration was short-lived. In the distance, they heard the sound of approaching vehicles. "They've detected us," Alex said, his face pale. "We need to go. Now." As they ran, Sarah's mind raced. They had proven it was possible to break the manipulator's control. It was a small victory, but an important one. The resistance had taken its first real step. The battle for humanity's mind had truly begun. And Sarah knew that no matter how long it took, they would keep fighting. Because the human spirit, with all its chaos and creativity, was not something that could be easily controlled. The war for Earth had just entered a new phase, and humanity was ready to show just how uncontrollable they could be. The manipulators were confused. For the first time in their long history of conquering planets, they faced a serious challenge. Humans, these primitive beings from a small blue planet, were resisting their control in ways they had never seen before. In their ship high above the Earth, the manipulator leaders gathered. Their usually calm faces showed signs of worry. "Report," the head manipulator commanded. One of the subordinates stepped forward. "We are facing difficulties," it said. "The human minds are unlike anything we've encountered." "Explain," the leader demanded. "Their thoughts are chaotic, unpredictable. Even when under our control, their minds wander. They create, they imagine, they dream. It's consuming much more energy to maintain control than we anticipated." The leader's eyes narrowed. "And what of the ones who resist completely?" "Their numbers are small, but growing. We've detected brief disruptions in our control field. We believe they're developing some kind of technology to interfere with our abilities." The head manipulator was silent for a moment. Then it spoke, its voice cold. "Increase the power of the control field. We must not lose our grip on this planet." Meanwhile, deep in an underground lab, Alex and his team of scientists worked tirelessly. They had been studying the brainwaves of the immune humans, trying to understand what made them different. "Look at this," Alex said, pointing to a screen filled with colorful waves. "When we expose a normal human brain to the manipulator's control signal, it falls into this regular pattern. But an immune brain—" He switched to a different image. "It's chaos. The signal bounces around, never settling into a pattern." Sarah leaned in, fascinated. "So our chaotic minds are our strength." "Exactly," Alex nodded. "The manipulator's control works by imposing order on our thoughts. But some of us, our minds are too noisy, for lack of a better word. We generate so many random thoughts and emotions that their signal gets lost in the noise." This discovery energized the resistance. They began working on ways to amplify the natural chaos of the human mind, to help more people break free from control. But they weren't the only ones making progress. The manipulators, frustrated by their lack of total control, began to change their tactics. One day, as Sarah was walking home from a secret meeting, she noticed something odd. The controlled humans around her seemed different. Their movements were jerkier, their faces tense. Suddenly, a man nearby let out a scream. He fell to his knees, clutching his head. All around her, people began to react in similar ways. Sarah ran, her heart pounding. She knew what this meant. The manipulators were increasing the strength of their control, forcing compliance through pain. When she reached the resistance hideout, she found the others already in an emergency meeting. "They're hurting people now," she gasped out. "We have to do something." George, the old psychology professor, spoke up. "This might actually be good news," he said. Everyone looked at him in shock. "Hear me out," he continued. "If they're resorting to crude tactics like pain, it means our natural resistance is working. They can't maintain subtle control anymore." Alex nodded slowly. "And pain. Pain is a very human experience. It might actually help people wake up, shocked them out of the artificial calm the manipulators imposed. The resistance realized they were at a turning point. The manipulators were getting desperate, which meant humanity had a real chance at freedom. They decided to accelerate their plans. Using the devices they had developed to disrupt the control field, they began to target key locations, hospitals, police stations, government buildings. It was dangerous work. The manipulators, realizing what was happening, began to fight back hard. Several resistance members were captured, but for each person they lost, more broke free from control and joined their cause. The human mind, with all its wonderful, terrifying complexity, was proving to be the ultimate weapon against alien control. Dreams, fears, hopes, wild ideas, all the things that made humans so frustratingly unpredictable were becoming their greatest strength. As the resistance grew, the manipulators found themselves facing an enemy they couldn't understand or predict. How do you control a species whose minds are a fortress of chaos, whose greatest strength is their refusal to fall in line? The battle for Earth was far from over, but for the first time, humanity had hope. In the vastness of the universe, on a small blue planet, a species was showing that sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't order and control, but the beautiful, chaotic potential of a free mind. The world had become a battleground, not of weapons and armies, but of minds and wills. 6 months had passed since the manipulators' arrival, and the conflict had reached a fever pitch. Sarah stood on a rooftop, looking out over the city. The once bustling streets were eerily quiet. In the distance, she could see the shimmering outline of a manipulator ship. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for what was to come. "Are you ready?" Alex asked, joining her at the edge of the roof. Sarah nodded. "As ready as I'll ever be." Today was the day of their biggest operation yet. The resistance had grown, spreading across the globe. They had a plan to strike at the heart of the manipulators' control. As they made their way down to the street, Sarah couldn't help but marvel at how much had changed. The manipulators, frustrated by their inability to fully control humans, had become more aggressive. They now used a combination of mental manipulation and physical intimidation to keep people in line. But this heavy-handed approach had backfired. More and more people were waking up, their minds rebelling against the harsh control. The resistance was growing stronger every day. Sarah and Alex met up with their team at an abandoned warehouse. George, the old psychology professor, was there, along with a dozen others. They gathered around a makeshift table covered in maps and diagrams. "All right, everyone," George began. "We know the manipulator's main control center is here." He pointed to a spot on the map. "It's heavily guarded, but we have an advantage they don't expect." Alex stepped forward, holding a small device. "This is the latest version of our disruptor," he explained. "But we've added something new. It doesn't just block their control signal. It amplifies our own brainwaves." A murmur of excitement ran through the group. Sarah felt a flicker of hope in her chest. "Our plan is to get close enough to activate this device," George continued. "If it works, it should create a feedback loop in their system. The chaos of our minds will be amplified and fed back into their control network." It was a risky plan, but it was the best chance they had. The teams split up, each group taking a different route to the control center. Sarah, Alex, and 2 others made their way through the quiet streets. They had to be careful. Manipulator patrols were everywhere, and controlled humans would report any suspicious activity. As they got closer to their target, Sarah felt a pressure building in her head. The manipulator's control field was stronger here. She saw her companions wince, fighting against the mental assault. Suddenly, an alarm blared. They'd been spotted. "Run," Sarah yelled. They sprinted towards the control center, dodging energy blasts from manipulator weapons. Controlled humans tried to block their path, but the resistance fighters pushed through. Finally, they reached the building. Alex pulled out the device, his hand shaking as he activated it. For a moment, nothing happened. Then Sarah felt it. A surge of energy, like electricity running through her mind. Around her, the controlled humans stumbled, confusion flickering across their faces. Inside the control center, chaos erupted. The manipulators, used to order and obedience, were overwhelmed by the flood of human thoughts and emotions pouring through their system. Sarah watched in awe as people in the street began to wake up. They looked around in confusion, then anger as they realized what had been done to them. But the battle wasn't over. The manipulators, realizing the threat, began to fight back with everything they had. The mental pressure intensified, causing Sarah to cry out in pain. "Don't give up," Alex shouted over the noise. "Keep thinking, keep feeling. Our minds are our weapons." Sarah closed her eyes, focusing on every thought and emotion she could muster. She thought of her family, her hopes, her fears. She let her mind race from idea to idea, embracing the beautiful chaos of human consciousness. Around the world, other resistance cells were doing the same thing. The manipulator's control network, designed for order and uniformity, was being overwhelmed by the sheer variety and intensity of human thought. For hours, the battle raged. It was unlike any conflict in human history. A war fought not with bombs and guns, but with ideas and emotions. As the sun began to set, Sarah felt the pressure in her mind begin to lessen. She opened her eyes to see the manipulator ship above them flickering, like a faulty light bulb. A cheer went up from the crowd. People were hugging each other, crying with joy and relief. They had won this battle. The manipulator's control had been broken, at least for now. But Sarah knew the war was far from over. The manipulators would regroup, try new tactics. But for the first time, she felt real hope. Humanity had proven that the strength of their minds, the power of their individuality, was a force to be reckoned with. As night fell on the freed city, Sarah looked up at the stars. The universe was vast and full of wonders, but also dangers. Yet she knew now, without a doubt, that humanity was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Their greatest weapon was not technology or physical strength, but the uncontrollable, beautiful chaos of the human mind. The victory against the manipulators had been sweet, but short-lived. 2 weeks after the battle that freed the city, the aliens returned with a vengeance. Their ships darkened the skies, and their control field came back stronger than ever. Sarah, Alex, and George huddled in their new hidden base, a forgotten subway station deep beneath the city. The mood was grim. Their last attack had worked, but the manipulators had adapted quickly. "We need something new," Sarah said, pacing back and forth. "They're expecting our mind disruption tactics now." Alex nodded, his face tired. "I've improved our devices, but it's not enough. We're running out of options." George, who had been quiet for a while, suddenly spoke up. "Maybe we've been looking at this the wrong way," he said slowly. Sarah and Alex turned to him, curious. "What do you mean?" Sarah asked. George stood up, excitement growing in his eyes. "We've been focusing on the chaos of our thoughts, the complexity of our minds. But there's something even more powerful, something uniquely human." "What's that?" Alex leaned forward, intrigued. "Emotions," George said simply. "Our feelings. Love, hate, joy, sorrow. The manipulators don't understand them. They can't control them." Sarah's eyes widened as she began to understand. "You're saying our emotions could be a weapon?" George nodded eagerly. "Think about it. When have you felt most alive, most human? It's not when you're thinking logically. It's when you're feeling deeply." The idea spread through the resistance like wildfire. They began to work on a new plan, one that would use the full spectrum of human emotions as a weapon against the manipulators. Over the next few days, they prepared. They modified their devices to not just disrupt the manipulators' control, but to amplify human emotions. They recruited artists, musicians, and storytellers to join their cause. The plan was risky. They would need to gather a large group of people and expose them to intense emotional experiences. The hope was that the surge of feelings would overwhelm the manipulator's control system. On the day of the operation, Sarah stood in front of a crowd in a hidden underground concert hall. She took a deep breath and began to speak. Today, we fight not with our fists or our guns, but with our hearts, she said. Feel everything. Don't hold back. Our emotions are our strength, our secret weapon. The lights dimmed, and the show began. Musicians played soul-stirring melodies. Actors performed scenes of great joy and deep sorrow. Artists created beautiful and terrifying images. As the emotions in the room intensified, Alex activated the amplifier devices. Sarah could feel the energy building, like electricity in the air. Suddenly, the ground shook. Above them, they could hear the sound of manipulator ships wavering. It's working. Alex shouted over the noise. Keep going. The performance reached a fever pitch. People in the crowd were crying, laughing, shouting. Every human emotion was on display, raw and powerful. Miles away, in their command ship, the manipulators were in chaos. Their control systems were overloading, unable to process the flood of human emotions. What is happening? The head manipulator demanded. How can they be resisting? But there was no answer. The manipulators, for all their advanced technology, had no defense against the pure, uncontrolled power of human feelings. Back in the underground hall, Sarah felt a shift in the air. The oppressive weight of the manipulator's control was lifting. She looked around and saw people waking up, their eyes clear and full of life. As the performance ended, a cheer went up from the crowd. They had done it. They had found a weapon the manipulators couldn't defend against. But Sarah knew this was just the beginning. The manipulators were wounded, but not defeated. The real battle was yet to come. As she looked out at the crowd, their faces shining with hope and determination, Sarah felt a surge of pride. This was humanity at its best, passionate, creative, and unstoppable. The manipulators had made a grave mistake. They had tried to control a species whose greatest strength was their ability to feel. And now, they were about to learn just how powerful human emotions could be. Sarah smiled. The secret weapon had been inside them all along. And now, it was time to use it to take back their world. The success of the emotion-amplifying event had given the resistance new hope. But Sarah, Alex, and George knew they couldn't stop there. To truly defeat the manipulators, they needed to wake up the entire world. We need to go bigger, Sarah said during a strategy meeting. Much bigger. Alex nodded, his eyes bright with excitement. I think I know how we can do it. We can use the manipulators' own communication network against them. The plan they came up with was audacious. They would hijack the manipulators' global control signal and use it to broadcast their emotion-amplifying wavelength worldwide. For weeks, they worked tirelessly. Alex and his team modified their devices, making them powerful enough to override the alien signal. Sarah and George organized resistance cells around the world, preparing them for the big day. Finally, everything was ready. Sarah stood in front of a large screen, watching as resistance members from every continent reported in. It was time. Remember, she said to the gathered crowd, when the signal hits, feel everything. Let your emotions run wild. It's our only chance. Alex took a deep breath and flipped the switch. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, suddenly, the air seemed to vibrate. Sarah felt a wave of emotion wash over her. Joy, fear, anger, love, all mixed together in a powerful surge. Around the world, people began to wake up. In New York, a businessman stopped mid-stride, blinking in confusion. In Tokyo, a group of school children burst into laughter for no apparent reason. In Rio de Janeiro, an old woman began to cry, remembering a long-lost love. The manipulators were caught off guard. Their control centers were flooded with a tidal wave of human emotion. Alarms blared as their systems began to overload. But the resistance wasn't done yet. As people woke up, pre-prepared messages began to play on every screen and speaker. You are free, the messages said. The aliens tried to control you, but they couldn't handle the power of human emotion. Feel, remember, fight back. Chaos erupted across the globe. People took to the streets, their faces a mix of confusion, anger, and joy. The manipulators tried to regain control, but it was too late. The floodgates of human emotion had been opened, and there was no closing them now. In their ships high above the earth, the manipulators were in panic. Nothing in their long history of conquests had prepared them for this. How is this possible? The head manipulator demanded. They're just primitive beings. But as they watched the scenes unfolding below, a terrible realization dawned. These primitive beings had done what no other species had ever managed. They had turned their own minds into a weapon. Back on Earth, Sarah and her team watched in awe as reports came in from around the world. Everywhere, humans were fighting back. In some cities, they were storming manipulator strongholds. In others, they were dismantling the alien technology that had kept them enslaved. It wasn't all peaceful. The sudden awakening had led to confusion, and in some places, violence. But even this worked against the manipulators. They had no defense against the raw, chaotic power of human free will. As the day wore on, more and more manipulator ships began to lift off, fleeing the planet they had thought would be an easy conquest. The sight of the retreating ships sent cheers erupting across the globe. Sarah felt tears in her eyes as she watched the scenes of celebration. They had done it. Against all odds, humanity had fought off an alien invasion using nothing but the power of their own minds and hearts. But even as she celebrated, Sarah knew their work wasn't over. The world was in chaos. People were confused, scared, and angry. Rebuilding would take time and effort. What now? Alex asked, coming to stand beside her. Sarah looked out at the cheering crowd, a determined smile on her face. Now, she said, we remind everyone what it means to be human. We've shown the universe the power of our emotions. It's time to show them the power of our compassion, our creativity, our ability to come together in the face of adversity. As the sun set on the first day of true freedom, humanity faced an uncertain future, but they faced it unafraid, their hearts and minds finally, truly their own. The manipulators had tried to conquer Earth, but in doing so, they had only awakened the true power of the human spirit. 1 year had passed since the day humanity broke free from the manipulators' control. The world had changed in ways no one could have imagined. Sarah stood on the balcony of the newly established Global Cooperation Center, looking out over a city that buzzed with energy and life. The past year had been challenging. After the initial euphoria of victory, the reality of rebuilding a world set in. But humans, true to their nature, faced the challenge head-on. Ready for the big speech? Alex asked, joining Sarah on the balcony. Sarah nodded, a mix of nervousness and excitement in her eyes. As ready as I'll ever be. Together, they walked into the main hall where representatives from every nation on Earth had gathered. The room fell silent as Sarah took the podium. 1 year ago, she began, her voice strong and clear. We faced an enemy that thought they could control us. They saw our minds as simple things to be manipulated. But they were wrong. She paused, looking out at the sea of faces. We showed them, and ourselves, the true power of the human spirit. Our emotions, our creativity, our ability to adapt and overcome. These are our greatest strengths. As Sarah spoke, screens around the room lit up, showing images from around the world. Cities rebuilt with new, innovative designs. Schools where children learned not just facts, but how to think critically and feel deeply. Laboratories where scientists worked on technologies inspired by their experience with the manipulators. We've done more than just rebuild, Sarah continued. We've grown. The manipulators thought they would conquer us, but instead, they pushed us to evolve. She gestured to a group of people sitting in the front row, George and other key members of the resistance. We've learned to harness the power of our minds in ways we never thought possible. The devices we use to amplify our emotions, we've adapted them into tools for healing, for learning, for connecting with each other on a deeper level. The images on the screens change, showing people using smaller versions of the emotion amplifiers. In hospitals, they helped patients recover from trauma. In schools, they allowed students to experience history and culture in vivid emotional detail. But perhaps the most important thing we've learned, Sarah said, her voice softening, is the value of our individuality. The manipulators failed because they couldn't understand or control the beautiful complexity of the human mind. Every thought, every feeling, every dream. These make us who we are. She paused, letting her words sink in. And yet, we've also learned the power of unity. When we came together, when we combined our individual strengths, we became unstoppable. The room erupted in applause. Sarah waited for it to die down before continuing. Today, we take the next step. We've been given a second chance, not just as nations, but as a species. The universe out there is vast and full of wonders and dangers. But we're ready for it. On the screens, images of sleek spaceships appeared. A gasp went through the crowd. Yes, Sarah smiled. We're going to the stars. But not as conquerors. We go as explorers, as learners, as living proof that the most powerful force in the universe is not technology or weapons or even the ability to control others. It's the power of a free mind and an open heart. As Sarah finished her speech, the applause was deafening. People stood, cheering and hugging each other. It was a moment of pure joy and hope for the future. Later, as Sarah, Alex, and George watched the sun set from the balcony, they reflected on how far they had come. "Do you think they're still out there?" Alex asked. "The manipulators?" Sarah nodded. "Probably. But I don't think we need to fear them anymore." George smiled, his eyes twinkling. "No, we don't. We've unlocked something they can never understand or defeat, the full potential of the human spirit." As the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Sarah felt a sense of peace and excitement. Humanity had faced its greatest challenge and emerged stronger, wiser, and more united. They had been tested and had discovered their true strength. The manipulators had come to Earth expecting to find a planet of primitive beings ripe for conquest. Instead, they had awakened a sleeping giant. Humanity, with all its flaws and all its potential, was now ready to take its place among the stars. As night fell, the city below them glowed with light and life, a beacon of hope in the vast darkness of space. Humanity, unshackled at last, was ready for whatever the universe might bring.